Hello and welcome back at 00Railways with me, Elizabeth. In this installment of Still Running Volume 3, we are going to talk about some coaches and some other information and some great tank engines that used to pull these coaches. A long-needed innovation was introduced by the GWR at the turn of the century, and this is all relating to coaches, and this was central heating achieved by the underseat radiators fed by a steam line from the locomotive. Hitherto, passengers had needed to swathe themselves in travelling rugs during winter journeys, just in the days of the stagecoach. The railways did provide food warmers, but these were only palliative. Coach illumination was also improving, linked with the design of coach roofs, the clerestory roof, in which the central section was raised and pierced with side windows, enhanced daytime illumination and provided space for night lamps, but it was more expensive to build and needed extra man hours to keep clean. Many railways still preferred it in the early years of the 20th century, but it was soon replaced by the elliptical roof. The latter, unlike the arc roof that had hitherto been the alternative shape, rose quite high and provided extra space for baggage. Previously, coaches were rather lower than the maximum allowable height. Different railways preferred different roof profiles, but it became the practice to build coaches as high as possible, and the clerestory lost its favour. Some coaches had a pronounced bulbous form, and on the LBSCR such vehicles were nicknamed balloon stock. The better trains tended to be composed of homogeneous stock, although the LNWR was notorious for combining in on-train coaches of varying shapes and sizes. Oil lamps long survived, but by 1875 gas lamps were preferred. Although the stored gas was a danger in accidents, the LNWR, never able to resist a promising economy, at one point believed it had solved the lighting problem by illuminating lamps and painting the compartment ceilings with luminous paint. However, if later redeemed itself by a wholesale adoption of electric lighting, its principal trains being so fitted by the 1890s, only 7 years after the LBSCR had first shown that it was practical to drive a dynamo from a coach axle. Together with the extension of new comforts to more trains and to cheaper class passengers, the last years of peace before 1914 saw the steady replacement of timber frames by steel. Many companies resisted the change, but those which used coaches over 55 feet long found that timber, despite its cheapness and convenience, was impracticable for the main frame least. For the most part, coach bodies continued to be fitted with timber, although there were a few examples of steel outer panels. Some railways began to build wider coaches. For the formerly 00Gauge GWR, this was easy, and its dreadnought coaches were 95 inches wide and 70 feet long. But even the GWR had to recess the indoors so as to reduce the overhang and curved track. Other companies found that by removing a few line-side structures, they would operate 9 feet wide coaches, although the SECR, whose lines had been built as cheaply as possible, could not do this. Every inch counted. Often, to gain an inch or two, door handles were recessed into the body for the coach. A width of 9 feet was especially valuable for suburban stock because just enables 6-side seating, bringing coach capacity typical to 66. The GER was on the pioneers of this trend and was pleased with its success that withdrew its 8 feet wide coaches, split them down to the middle and insert and central sections and return them to traffic as 9 feet footers. Later, when companies began to replace their close-coupled four-wheel suburban coaches with bogie coaches, the GER achieved a simpler, cheap transformation by mounting pairs of its four-wheeler bodies on new bogie underframes. Suing region that was especially prosperous. The GER understood the difficulties of making ends meet, and it was quite appropriate that in the 1980s it became the first railway to provide dining facilities for this class passenger. Here too it's economized, for instead of using bogie vehicles for dining cars, it chose to put together a dining car set of 3 X-wheelers linked to each other, but not the rest of the train with gangways. Nigel Gresley of the Great Northern succeeded in reducing the key per seat status and suburban vehicles by making success of the articulated train set. In this adjoining coach ends shed dingle bogie and Gresley's first articulated trains, considered of 4 tow car sets coupled together, each set bringing in just 3 bogies. Gresley also built dining car sets on the same principle and used it for the streamlined train he later built for the LNER. The 260 types of the smaller and medium versions were derived from similar LmS designs, while the latter was the least necessary of the BR designs. It weighed a mere 2 tons more than the medium type, enabling a slight higher boiler pressure to be used. The smaller variant formed the basis of a lightweight 262 tank locomotive, which was supplemented a slight larger tank locomotive for the same wheel arrangement. The 264 tank was more numerous than either of these and could be regarded as the final flowering of the Stania 264 tank introduced in the 1930s. Much more enterprising was the freight 210, of which more than 250 examples were built and of which number 9220 was destined to be blast steam locomotive built for BR. Of the 462s made their way all the way to Buenos Aires, and the later 462s were also named typical after Argentinian generals and birds, and after nationalization 2 new engines were named General Perón and Eva Perón, but were hurriedly renamed after the political upheaval of 1955. Like other large countries in which early railway building had been entrusted in Britons, the Argentine had a gauge problem, with 4 British-owned broad gauge 5-foot 6-inch companies, 2 standard gauge and 1 meter gauge in practice, because lines tended to converge on the capital and the ports. Little through train running would have been attempted in any case, and the gauge problem was not as enormous as it was in Australia. The Bags was the largest of the Argentinian companies, owning about 850 locomotives in its busiest state. It had a very British-looking 460 passenger locomotive service, and many of which were named. Generally mixed traffic engines. Please note that a 3-cylinder, like the image here, was a 264 tank locomotive design supplied by 3 British builders to the Buenos Aires Great Southern Railway in the 1920s, and the unit is hauling a suburban train into Buenos Aires. And thank you very much everyone for joining me again at the Still Running Volume 3, and please be lookout for the next installment, and I wish you all the best. As always, regards, Elizabeth.